for Britlet Survey, Summer 1, 2017. For class today, I'm doing the video recording of my commentary on Hopkins poetry. You're expected to watch the video to answer the several questions that I'll be asking periodically throughout the video, and to submit those answers to my questions within 48 hours of the class period for which this video was recorded, which gives you, 48 hours to respond to those questions, to identify what the questions are. I'm not going to hold up a sign or anything that says this is question number 1, etc. It's going to require you to listen to and unfortunately watch this video in order to hear when those questions are being asked, right? So, we arrive at Gerard Manley Hopkins at the end of the Victorian era. He's a late Victorian poet, but the curious thing about Gerard Manley Hopkins is, of course, that his poetry did not see print when he was living, not during the late Victorian era, but rather during the modernist era, 1918, when a friend of his published his poetry with other modernist poets because of the affinity that he had with contemporary poets at the time, which would mean, of course, that Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry was well ahead of the curve in the late Victorian era, or the late 19th century, by virtue of the fact that it uses a lot of really unique devices, carries a lot of stylistic experimentation, plays with form and style in ways that the modernists played with, although it also concerns itself with relatively quote-unquote conservative bourgeois Victorian values, right? Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry is also really unique for the fact that it's largely Catholic in a majority Protestant country, and that it reflects those values and his faith and his struggles with his faith in particular. Gerard Manley Hopkins was a Jesuit priest, which is to say that he joined an order of Catholicism that has always traditionally been focused on scholarship, on learning, etc., and he was a convert to Catholicism during the Oxford Group movement in the mid-19th century under the guidance of Cardinal Newman, who was a professor in Oxford, but who also worked to gradually convert a number of, in large case, of course, wealthy young British men to Catholicism in the mid-19th century, and so it was part of a larger movement that was a bit outside the norm. Hopkins was by repute queer, right, or at least by our readings of his life and his works, and it's possible, of course, that he conceived of a retreat to Catholicism as a way to smooth over or otherwise not acknowledge or repress or suppress his queer desire. So one of the things you'll find often in his poetry is a physicality that's sublimated, and a physicality that is enacted in language and in the form of the poetry itself, that sort of bring attention back to the body and to ecstasy, right? One of the things that we've talked about before in terms of faith and Christianity is the sort of the ecstatic strain in Christian religion, right? Which is the notion that the body is likewise a vessel for the inspiration of God, not just the mind, the intellect, or the soul, as it were, rather, but that the body might be a locus for experiencing God and experiencing an understanding of God and the world around you. Now, another feature of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry and his philosophy was this idea of inscape. And inscape is a way to uncover in the very nature of language itself the architecture, the structure, the nature of nature, right? In other words, inscape reveals to us the ways in which God as architect, God as designer, God as organizer makes apparent the whole world along the same logical lines. Inscape, or the belief that things have, between language and the things themselves, a soul or peace or a manifestation of God, is deeply aligned with the philosophical concept of immanence, and that's I-M-M-A-N-E-N-C-E. Immanence is not a typically Catholic idea, and it has been derided over the years and centuries philosophically as being a sort of weak pantheism, or worse, a kind of atheism. But Hopkins' belief in the immanence of God, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-C-E, the immanence of God is such that he believes that everything that is created is a reflection of God's purpose, God's values, and God's work, right? And he applies this both to sort of nature, right? So animals, plants, flowers, the earth itself. He applies it to these things, but he also sees that second-hand creations, the things that man makes from nature, likewise sort of bear an echo of God's creation and God's purpose. That said, of course, man's creation, he fears, is always going to be weaker than God's creation itself. And as we can see in some of the dark sonnets where he's struggling with his faith, he worries, of course, that failure of man's creation in light of God's creation totally ruins his poetry, to be sort of frank, right? Hopkins was one of those literary giants who, like Kafka, sought to erase all proof of his artistic creation. For Kafka, it was because he felt he was embarrassed by the work that he'd made. For Hopkins, it was because he worried that he hadn't been godly enough, right? And was concerned that his career might be judged on what could be construed as it were, pantheistic or construed as irreligious or blasphemous, in spite of the fact that, of course, I think, personally speaking anyway, his poetry is some of the most sort of passionately skeptical, passionately engaged, and passionately critical about religion and philosophy and faith. And so, again, like Donne's Holy Sonnets, right, I think they prove that struggling with faith is a way to be faithful and to practice faith, as opposed to understanding faith as a passive or as an undone or undoing thing. So Inscape, also, again, so I say Inscape is the bridge between language and nature, not quite. Inscape is the manifestation of God's architecture in nature. In Stress is the bridge between language and nature. So language, like rock or boulder, contain within them the kind of stress that corresponds to the very nature of the thing itself, and by virtue of corresponding to the nature of the thing itself, thus corresponds to the thing that is godly in it, right? So for this reason, Hopkins' poetry is rife with these one-syllable Anglo-Saxon words, right? These sort of hard syllabic consonantal and consonant and alliterative words, right? One of the things I'd like you to do in question number 1 would be to take a look at, for instance, God's grandeur. So question number 1 is take a look at God's grandeur and mark out every instance you find of alliteration, assonance, and consonance. And so again, question number 1 is for you to take a look at God's grandeur and mark out every instance you find of alliteration, assonance, and consonance. And of course, alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginnings of words, or vowel sounds at the beginnings of words. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds both in and outside of words, as it were. And consonance is a repetition of consonant sounds inside words, right? So be thinking about where you find assonance, consonants, and alliteration. And so in Stress, to bring it back to that, in Stress is the nature of the thing inside language. And so those Anglo-Saxon words, right? Another innovation of Gerard Manley Hopkins is, of course, the way that he makes these compound words. And if anybody's read Cormac McCarthy or Toni Morrison or even Melville, this is sort of more contemporary, more modern tendency to play with language, to make compound, complex constructions out of the simple syllabic building blocks of words. Of course, one of those famous ones is dapple, dawn, drawn, falcon, right? Dapple, dawn, drawn, being one of those moments where he's pointing to the complex nature of a phenomenon itself. Think about it this way, right? You look out a window and you see, the sky, and the sky looks, and the clouds look to sort of encapsulate or repeat. For instance, I'm looking out at the sky from my window in my office, and there's a bunch of stratus clouds, right? And so it looks like, on some level, corduroy whales, right? the ridges of corduroy painted along the sky in sort of wispy white clouds, and so I might call it corduroy whale sky, right, as a way to encapsulate the certain kind of image that we see when we see something in a very particular way, right? Gerard Manley Hopkins is really good with these particularities, particularities that are nevertheless recognizable and nevertheless sort of beautifully linguistically constructed, right? The other aspect of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry is his sort of play with form. And so he plays with the sonnet form in particular. Of course, we know from our own study of sonnets, especially around Donne and Sidney, that they're 14-line things, right? And thus relatively constrained by the number of lines and syllables that might appear in such a poem, with certain characteristics, right? Elizabethan, Petrarchan, or Spenserian sonnet, rhyme schemes in terms of that, different meters, etc. But more than the simple sonnets, of which there are several, right? And I'll go over a couple of the 14-liners. He also invented the form of the curtal sonnet, and that's C-U-R-T-A-L. Now, there are very few curtal sonnets, right? One of those is Pied Beauty. We'll talk about Pied Beauty. Because no one else does curtal sonnets, it's not a huge thing to worry about. Except that he does a certain kind of math, which is to say that he filters the sonnet with its 14 lines and its expected number of syllables through a certain kind of mathematical formula that reduces it to 9.5 lines, and otherwise sort of collapses the number of syllables that might be contained in that 14-line sonnet. And so Pied Beauty is one of those manifestations. When I talk about Pied Beauty, we'll talk about some of the things that make it different from the other poems that he's writing at this moment. So let's begin by taking a look at the first few poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins. We'll take a look at God's Grandeur. I'll read it out loud, and one of the things that I'll ask you to listen for, and I'll read it out loud twice, is, of course, grammar, which is to say listen to the ways in which enjambment works to carry over grammatical ideas from one line of poetry to the next. And I also want you to hear any rhymes that might be happening, especially end rhymes, and to go back to that first question, of course, any other internal rhymes, right, that you might see. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. And wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell, the soil is bare now, nor can foot feel, being shod. And for all this nature is never spent, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, O morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with awe bright wings. So God's Grandeur, right? The title of the poem gives us a sense of the kind of thing that he's attempting to do here, both sort of describe what the grandeur of God is, the grandiosity of his creation, but also, as you can imagine, to pay homage, right, to the work of God as creator. And to acknowledge the scale and the scope of it, right? Grandeur doesn't suggest something small or contained or wee or cute, but rather sort of large scale, big canvas, big natural beauty, right? And so God's Grandeur speaks to how we understand both the beauty of his creation, insofar as we understand created things, but also the beauty of his creation as much as we understand creation as activity, as labor, as doing, making, or ongoing work, right? And so grandeur allows us to see not just the finished product, but also the process by which the product is made, and to recognize that both contribute to our understanding of the awesomeness of God, right? And of course awesome in as much as he might be terrifying and wondrous, or amazing and scary, frightening. So the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. Now, what does shook foil look like, right? I mean, you've got a piece of foil, you've got a reflective surface. It's not talking about the aluminum foil, of course, that we cover our leftovers with, but rather, sheets of foil that might be used as cladding or as roofing material, or as we can sort of sense from the usage of the word here, shook foil, as a theatrical device, right? As a way to create the sound of a thunderstorm by virtue of shaking a flat panel of aluminum or foil or steel. Also, he explains in the image, in the footnote here, quote, I mean foil in the sense of leaf or tinsel. Shaken gold foil gives up broad glares like sheet lightning. And also, and this is true of nothing else, owing to its zigzag dints and creasings and network of small many-cornered facets, a sort of fork lightning too. So we've got my sort of theatrical explanation, sort of the noise making and sort of the interrupting glare of lightning, of reflection, of light, the sun, as well as the sound, right? And thinking of all of the electrical languages here, right? Flaming, charged, shining, right? As he explains himself in that footnote that we've got to the poem, he's thinking of the way that light plays off of the reflective surface of foil, and the way that it might be bent or folded and create new runnels or creaks or crevices for the reflection of light. So to that end, right, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. Think too about what it's like to watch the sun set, right? You see the rays of the sun breaking out of the crest of the hill, especially around here in Chattanooga. We can see, sort of that radiant corona as it starts to set. It gets a different color, takes on a different hue, gets richer, deeper, darker, changes. We may not watch the sunset and think about the pace of change in the colors or the hue or the light that we see, but nevertheless, it's changing, it's altering. It gathers to a greatness, so think there of sunrise, right, in the ways that the light comes up over the hill, sort of crystallizes itself and then beams down on us. Like the ooze of oil crushed, right? So we've got really important enjambment there between the ooze of oil and then crushed. Taking a look here too, again, we've got the idea of the crushing of olives in the footnote, and this is making a natural thing into a more complicated man-adjusted thing, deriving oil from olives, which we would have picked from trees, etc., sort of connecting us to the soil, and we'll talk about the soil here in a sec, connecting us to the soil itself as of earth and of dirt, right? But also to, again, the work of creativity and labor, of doing something. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? And that's one of those weirdly constructed Hopkinsian questions that inverts the order of words, in large part, as we can tell here, to put certain kinds of sounds in order and next to each other. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? So think about the progression of the vowel sounds in that line. And men then, the internal rhyme that happens there, now not wreck rod, right? And think about the ways that he's constructing a very intentional syntactical inversion in order to make these sounds happen. Think too about what it means that all of the words in that line 4, right, are single syllable words. Crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? And each one requires a certain kind of halo or bubble around the word while you speak it out loud, which creates that sort of choppy bam, 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 right? Ends with the rhetorical question, why do men then now not wreck his rod? And reckon, listen, hear, understand. And rod, the thing that you might beat someone with, right? Spare the rod and spoil the child. Generations have trod, have trod, have trod. So we've got this 4-syllable word, generations, and then we've got the repeated foot, have trod, have trod, have trod. Now, question number 2 is, what is the meter of that foot, have trod? So write that down. But it's repeated 3 times, right? And why do you think it's repeated 3 times? It's repeated 3 times because on some level, of course, it echoes for us the work of walking, of plodding, of walking grudgingly and slowly, have trod, have trod, have trod. And then we have the and that starts line 6. And all is seared with trade. Seared, burned, right? With trade. Trade, not just exchange, but also the making of things, right? Think about trade school. And all is seared with trade. And so we apply our force and our labor to things, right? To nature, to earth. And as such, we mark them, and not always in a good way, Hopkins would say. We're getting farther away from the purity of God's creation when we do these things. Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. Seared, bleared, smeared. Obviously, we hear the triplicate echo there. We've got toil, oil, foil. And bleary, smeary. These are imprecise words. They're not incorrect words, but they're not sort of technical or scientific or clear cut. They're smudgy, right? Smeared. And wears man smudge, and shares man smell the soil. Think about man's smell. It's not pleasant, certainly not after a long working day, certainly not after a long working day in the fields that have been capped off by you crushing those olives in the big pit in order to make oil, right, and to make good on the investment of your agricultural labor. You stink, right? And nature now, this olive oil thing, is smeared with our sweats and our effort, right? And so no longer pure, but important. But nevertheless, it's us. It's not God who makes oil. It's us who makes oil from olives, right? The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And think here between feet that are bare and feet that are shod, and what it means to take your foot off and take your shoes off. Rather, you don't want to take your feet off. Take your shoes off and put your feet on the bare ground. Right? It gives you a sort of connection to earth, to God, to the fundament, to the foundation of things, and allows you to be present, to feel present, and to make direct contact with the living earth. Right? And then we have another and. So we got ands in 5 and 6 starting the lines, as well as 9 and 11. And for all this, nature is never spent. Think about trade there, and trade's double meaning is both something that is exchanged and something that is fabricated. Spent here both in terms of spending money and making an expenditure there, but also spent as in empty, right, as in totally done. And for all this, nature is never spent. In other words, this is a poem before climate change and global warming and resource crisis, right? Because it's telling us that God's creation is so abundant, right? That there's nothing that we could do. We might be able to ruin it or to make it, useful to humans in a processed and labored kind of way. But we can't exhaust Earth's or God's resources, right? It's never spent. It would seem naive now to imagine that. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And what's missing there is in things, right? And so you can imagine, of course, that that's meant to make the line scan. And so there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. You can see, of course, that it scans. In would expand that line and would also interrupt deep down things, right? Because when we think about inscape and in stress, when we think about immanence, God in and of all things, then deep down things, like your soul and your beliefs and your ideas about the world, are also things. They're kind of material, and they likewise reflect God's power and His creation, right? And so it's important to understand that these things are part of us, that the material is part of us. We are material. All things are made by God, created by God. And so it's all sort of, all of it is made, all of it is real. And though the last lights off the black west went, and you should, of course, just hear the wonderful, again, progression or procession of vowel sounds, as well as the internal rhymes. O morning at the brown brink eastward springs. And think about springs as leaping, but also as sort of coming up out of the ground, burbling. Because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. And so what I want you to do for question number 3 is just explain what's happening with B's and W's in that last line of God's grandeur, right? I want you to come up with a good interpretive reason. Why are there all those B's and W's, and why in that order, and what do they sound like? What does that make it all sound like? I want you to think about that final image in the poem and what it's telling us God is, right? So I want you just to think what it means to read from the start of the sonnet to the end of the sonnet. Think about what changes, and think about the final image that it resolves on, right? I'm not going to coach you through all of that. I want you to do some of that thinking yourself. We're going to move on to As Kingfishers Catch Fire. We're not going to spend... No, actually we're going to skip As Kingfishers Catch Fire. We're going to go to the Windhover, the Windhover being yet another one of the more important Hopkins poems. This one is footnoted. Of course, the Windhover is, as it explains, a kestrel, a small falcon that's indigenous to the Great British Isles. And it also is something that sort of hovers, and that just sort of stays there, almost like a helicopter suspended in air, right? But it also comes with a dedication to Christ our Lord, right? And so when you think about that dedication, you think about what it means to implicate the reader in that collectivity, our Lord, right? And so he's presuming, of course, that the audience for this poetry is going to be as spiritual as he is, and likewise as Catholic as he is in this particular instance, or at least as Christian as he is. And so to Christ our Lord implicates that the reader of the poem is likewise interested in understanding God, right? So the Windhover. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dapple dawn-drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him, steady air, and striding high there, how he hung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy, then off forth on swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend, the hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind, my heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valor in act, air pride plume here buckle, and the fire that breaks from thee then, a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous, my chevalier. No wonder of it. Sheer plod makes plough down Cillian, shine and blue bleak embers, my dear, fall, gall themselves in gash gold vermilion. So the first question I have, and this would be question number 4 for those keeping count, right, is in the Windhover. How does enjambment work here? And I want you to give me a substantial answer here. Read the poem. Explain to me why enjambment works the way that it works. Explain to me how it works. One of the things you'll hear is that when you read this out loud, and I really want you to practice doing so, so I will be silent and I guess look out the window for a couple of minutes while I have you read at least the first couple of lines, the first 5 lines to yourself, all right? All right, so inasmuch as this is a poem about God, or Christ, and a hawk, right, then hopefully that'll explain on some level some of the enjambment that you're hearing, right, especially in keeping with the idea that the kestrel can sort of stay in place or hover or sort of suspend itself there. One of the first things that we see, of course, in the first line is a repetition of morning, right? I caught this morning, right, so thinking of that as one phrase, morning's minion as another phrase, right? But inasmuch as morning and morning repeat itself, think about the ways in which it's invoking multiple meanings of the word morning, contexts for the word morning, and think about the other words that it sounds like morning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, right? And minion, of course, we know this. The gloss in the book is darling, although we can also think of servant or sort of helpmate. Dauphin, D-A-U-P-H-I-N, as sort of the prince. Dawn-drawn falcon in his riding, of the rolling level underneath him, steady air and striding, gliding, hiding, right? So when you think about rhyme schemes and rhyming words, and as we've said before, the way that they form units with each other, they might match up with each other or pair up with each other, and think about the ways that that also constructs meaning inside the poem itself. The wimpling wing. Now, of course, if we were doing alliteration consonants for the Windhover, there'd be tons of it here, right? Wimpling wing, dumb daylights doff and dapple don drawn, right? All in that second line, da 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 da. Wimpling wing, sweep smooth, bow bend, right? So these repetitive consonant sounds, right, create that hard, chunky, especially in that second line, right? Dunk, 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 dunk. Sound that really underscores just the physicality of language. When I created that space for you to read those first few lines of the poems yourself, I was hoping, of course, you'd do that out loud, because to perform it is to hear, of course, the sounds break your mouth every time they come up, right? Kingdom of daylights doff and dapple don drawn falcon in his riding, right? And you can kind of hear the percussive and feel the percussive breath come out of your body as you're hitting every one of those singular syllables, right? And you can't not hit every single one of those singular syllables, right? And so we've got this image of the Windhover, of Christ our Lord, as the hawk, of the hawk, sort of all sitting there in that first stanza, just up there, right? And so you're sort of already looking towards the heavens, towards the Empyrean. You're sort of wondering and marveling at the immensity of the sky on, above. Then you see this sort of beautifully well-made thing sitting there in the midst of your field of view and thinking about what it's like to be, and to be a subject here on the ground, and to be a subject that feels itself compelled by and enthralled to God. And to see that other created thing in the sky above you looking down, right? And the way that that also figures as the viewpoint or the omniscience of God or of Jesus, right? In those last two lines of the first stanza, my heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of the mastery of the thing. Stirred for a bird is just a funny little phrase, of course, in and of itself, but it's an exact rhyme, right? And it's this idea that your body is being compelled by this view that you see, by this falcon. The achieve of the mastery of the thing, repetition of the idea of achievement or mastery. So achievements, a created final thing. An achievement is something that is out in the world autonomously, independently. The mastery of the thing both sort of speaks to the skills and the innate nature of the hawk itself, that it can do this thing, that it can hover and hunt and fly, but also the mastery of the making of the thing, right? So if I was talking about in God's grandeur, on the one hand, the difference between the completed, created object and the grandiosity and the amazingness of the labor itself, the ability to do it, the inclination to do it, doing it. Then here we see in the achieve of, the mastery of the thing, what seems like a repetition or a correction, but is instead sort of an enunciation of two different kinds, completed things and the work of completing. Then we've got one of my sort of favorite passages in literature, period, lines 9 through 11. Brute, beauty, and valor in act, oh, air, pride, plume, here, buckle! Exclamation point. Nobody uses exclamation points in poetry, or they don't do it often enough. Brute beauty, I mean this rough, dangerous predator. It's going to kill things, it's going to kill you. But it's beautiful, and it is undoubtedly powerful in its ability to do this. And valor and act. Beauty and valor and act, I mean, these are sort of courtly, knightly things. This is what Lancelot has, right? As well as this hawk, as well as the notion of Jesus as conqueror, as militant, as knight, right, from the Crusades. Oh, air, pride, plume, here, buckle. And the sort of the shouts, the gasping breath, oh, air, pride, plume, here, buckle, right? It accelerates, it crescendos, and it reaches that sort of buckle, right? Because you're waiting. Imagine going up and up and up and up a roller coaster, right? You're sort of catching on the gears, chunking up that hill. You know what's coming on the other side of this. You're watching the hawk in the air. You see it poised there. It's just sitting there about to do something, and your breath is catching. You're waiting for it, and then it buckles, breaks, right, or falls or collapses, and it just sort of dives out of the sky. Brute beauty and valor and act, O air, pride, plume, here buckle. And the fire that breaks from thee, then 1,000,000,000 times told lovelier, more dangerous, O my chevalier. And so if the, let's call it the potential energy of the hawk as it's suspended there, right? Its propensity to do violence and to kill and to hunt and to eat is all there, but it's not acted upon, but it becomes kinetic in this total small caps and the fire, right? And so it's moving in that and it's all in that small caps, a very intentional sort of typographical choice, because it's a cresting and the fire that breaks from thee then, right? So the fire, like shook foil, right? Sort of flashing out from the bend of the wings as it just dives, right? Dead dives. From thee then 1,000,000,000 times told, 1,000,000,000 times told, lovelier, more dangerous, O my chevalier, my knight, right? And 1,000,000,000, it invokes the sort of the language of the stars as single points of light in the sky. Likewise evidence of God's grandeur, likewise evidence of unknowable immensities, right? And present, but distant and numerous, 1,000,000,000. So that this one sort of flash of light on the wing of a hawk as it dives is not unlike the beauty of the stars that God himself has also created. That's Ruby. She's cleaning my trash can. No wonder of it, right? So it's 1,000,000,000 times told lovelier, more dangerous, but no wonder of it, right? No wonder it's there, right? No wonder it's made. I don't have to wonder about this. I know that God made it. No wonder of it. And there it is, right? It's just kind of in there, in that moment. Sheer plod, and those diacritical marks on sheer plod are intended to be force syllables, right? So sheer plod makes plow down Cillian shine. Cillian here is the ridge between two furrows of a plowed field. Shine. So we're thinking here, we had and trod and trod and trod and plod and shod and God in the first poem, God's grandeur. Here, we're finally placed in the same kind of a setting, in an agricultural setting, in a field full of furrows, planting. And this idea of just this sort of the falling from the sky, the reflecting that light, and then sort of running into those tunnels in order to get your prey as it's flushed out from the field, right? And blue bleak embers, ah, my dear. So we've got fire and embers, all sort of, it's flaming, it's falling, it's flashing, and then it's gone. It's temporal, it's ephemeral. Blue bleak embers, ah, my dear, fall, gall, and here break the surface of is the definition of gall. Fall, gall themselves, and gash gold vermilion. So think about the violence of a hawk eating its prey, right? It's rending its prey from limb to limb, and it's just sort of tearing it apart with its razor-sharp talons and beaks. And thinking about the way that the glint of the sun off the wing of the diving hawk against the soft brown field creates this one quick flash of gold-red light, right? That sort of synthesizes hawk and sky and sun and God all in that same moment, in a way that is sort of beautiful and optic, but also visceral and bloody. Gash, gold, vermilion, fall, and gash, right? All of these things speaking to the inconstancy or the interruption of the flash, right? That's the Windhover. You've had 4 questions so far. Let's talk about Pied Beauty, which is the next poem in the thing. And, as I said earlier, the Curtal sonnet, right? So think about the ways, and again, I'm not going to make you scan this or anything like that, although I will have you scan at least 1 or 2 lines just with sort of the marks, not with any statement about what it means or what the meter translates to. I just want you to see what it looks like. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-cold chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickled, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle dim, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change, praise him. So, I want you to, and this is question number 5 for Hopkins, right? I want you to mark out the meter of lines 1 and 2 of Pied Beauty, right? I want you to just take a look at what emphasis each syllable gets. And it's going to require you to read it out loud to yourself. But we've got some double syllable words, some single syllable words, so just mark out what gets emphasis, right? So what is pied? Now the footnote gives us 2 or more colors variegated, right? So a pied cow is a spotted cow or a dog, right? And so Pied Beauty talks about the multiplicity in things, of qualities in things, the duality of qualities in things. And so, this notion that a Dalmatian may not be beautiful because it's not a pure white, Hopkins is going to say it's beautiful because it's got black spots and white spots too, or white background, right? And so Hopkins wants to celebrate these things that are sort of imperfect repetitions, sort of contain dualities, are otherwise marked or spotted, right? Think about the mark of Cain from Beowulf and the way that sort of external sign is communicated down as a sign of evil on Grendel and Grendel's mama. So we got Pied Beauty. And so he says, glory be to God for dappled things. And so this is sort of a paean, P-A-E-A-N, or an ode, right? We will have talked about odes when we talked about Keats and Keats's poetry. And dedicatory verse, what it means to sort of send up a poem to a particular thing, concept, object, etc. Ode on melancholy, etc. So glory be to God for dappled things, couple color, brinded, stipple, plotted and pieced, etc. So I want us to think about all of the things that are listed here as being pied or dappled or stippled, of having 2 colors or imperfect marks or repetitions. We've got a brinded cow, we've got skies of couple color, and think about the way the blue sky versus the white clouds, or gray and white and blue and black clouds during a storm, etc. Rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim. We don't often look at trout swimming in a stream, but they are sort of dotted with dark green and pink and other colors. And here this rose mole, this notion of sort of the pink spots on the side of a brook trout. Fresh fire coal, think about the way that a fire itself is sort of red and orange and black and smoke, and it's flaming and changing and altering. Chestnut falls, here fallen chestnuts, and so all of the dots of nuts on the ground that break up the color of fallen leaves, or the color of the green of the ground itself. And so we've got a compound image here, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls. Finches' wings, right? Birds' wings, in the way that they have different colors, variegations, lines, bars, etc. Landscape plotted and pieced. And so we make the leap from sky to animals, right? To trees and birds, and then we move down to the ground itself. And so one of the things he's looking at is the agricultural space, which appears in the other 2 poems, and looking at farms and fields and plow marks and furrows, etc., as evidence of, again, our own kind of infliction of this dappled or pied nature to nature, the way that we alter the earth, and thus sort of create imperfections that he's otherwise celebrating as perfections when God himself is responsible, right? And then we have, as we did in the other poem where we had the list, brute, beauty, valor, acto, air, pride, plume here, we've got the same sort of thing here in line 7. All things counter, original, spare, strange, right? All of the weirdy dog stuff, right? All of the weirdness. He wants to celebrate those things, the abnormalities, the non-normativities, the things that aren't supposed to happen. All of these things he wants to celebrate in order to, again, sort of give homage or pay homage to God, right? Whatever is fickle, freckled, and I think one of the things I like most about Hopkins are these rhetorical questions in parentheses. Who knows how, right? Because it's a sort of a performance of the humility of not knowing. He enjoys God, he celebrates God, God created, but he couldn't possibly tell you exactly how God created or by what process. Of course, he's not a physicist or a cosmologist or an astrologer or astronomer or any of those things. He, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim, and think about these sort of pairs of binary words. These are opposites, fast and slow, sweet and sour, dazzle and dim. He fathers forth whose beauty is past change, praise him. And that last praise him is a command, right? But also sort of a description of what he's doing. It's a request. You should do this if you understand yourself to be a weirdo. You should praise him for being a weirdy dog, right? You should praise him for making all of the weird things in nature, for being weird, precisely because even if it seems imperfect, it's not because the devil's involved, it's because God chose to make it so, right? At this point in time, I'm going to give you a real quick pause, break the video, and give you some sort of break to go get water. I'm going to record a couple of comments on spring and fall, carrying comforts, and then talk about the dark sonnets more generally. Those are the things that you can memorize. Now, when you're thinking of memorizing a poem, any one of the 14-line stanzas is fine. That would be God's Grandeur, Starlit Night, Kingfishers Catch Fire, Spring, Windhover, Hurrahing and Harvest, Duns Scotus's Oxford, Felix Randall, Carrying Comfort, No Worse There's None, and I wake and feel the fell of dark not day. So you can memorize any one of those things, rehearse it and say it without notes, passionately and performatively, dramatically, in order to receive some makeup points for the assignments or the shortcomings of your assignments, all right? All right, we're back, and we're going to talk about Spring and Fall by Gerard Manley Hopkins, as well as Carrying Comfort in the Dark Sonnets. At the end of the last part of the video, I told you which of those poems you can memorize for extra credit. I would encourage you to email me, of course, any which of those poems you'd like to memorize. I don't want any duplicates, ideally, just because I think everybody could memorize a different one. So just hit me up with which one you'd like to do, and I don't know that there's anybody who couldn't use the additional points. All of that is to say we're going to talk about spring and fall. Now, spring and fall is, as the footnote to the title of the poem indicates, a couple of things, right? It would seem to be a really simple poem at first reading, really childlike, childish. We should be thinking, of course, about Goblin Market and the way that that creates sing-songy child rhymes in order to convey a really complicated, and in that case, dark message. This is no less dark, but it's more theological. Spring and fall, of course, two different seasons and two different transitional seasons. Spring, into which summer manifests and creates verdancy and life and thriving, and fall, which is sort of the transition to decay, darkness, death, winter, etc., right? So we got spring and fall, the two seasons, and two transitional seasons. We also have sort of spring, a leaping, fall, falling. We also have fall, original sin, right? The fall from the Garden of Eden, and that is the fall that's being discussed here, right? One of the things that's played out in the course of this poem is the Catholic doctrine of original sin. So often, when I speak of the terrible tradition and history of biblical interpretations of the Garden of Eden and the expulsion of Eve and Adam from the Eden, by virtue of Eve eating the apple and how patriarchally that sets up the conditions of servitude for women and also the conditions by which they're abused for communicating that kind of sin throughout the community, through the world, etc. Original sin is sort of a Catholic belief that that original feminine sin gets communicated to all babies, and that would be all of us, right? Since none of us, since Jesus ostensibly has been made by alien insemination, that all babies sort of communicate this essentially feminine, matriarchal, maternal sin to the rest of the world, right? So children in Catholic theology and Catholic doctrine are not saved, right, until they're baptized, because they carry with them the taint of original sin. So we've got spring and fall, has all of those implications in the title, and then it's got the legend or the inscription to a young child, right? Think back to the Windover, which is to Christ our Lord, and so this dedicatory sort of line tells that this is for kids, and not just kids, but really small kids, right? Young children. It's got all of the force sort of indications, and so it tells you very specifically how this poem is meant to be read. So when I read it out loud, I'm going to read it out loud twice. Once, again, with the first time, with emphasis on enjayment and the way that the lines carry over into the next. The second time, by virtue of putting the clear emphasis on the words that he expects that we put emphasis on. Margaret, are you grieving over golden grove unleaving? Leaves like the things of man, you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder by and by, nor spare a sigh, though worlds of one would leaf meal lie. And yet you will weep and know why. Now no matter, child, the name, sorrow's springs are the same, nor mouth had, known nor mind, expressed what heart heard of, ghost guessed. It is the blight man was born for, it is Margaret you mourn for. Now, reading it with the clearly indicated emphasis, you get a slightly more sort of forceful reading of the same text. Margaret, are you grieving over golden grove unleaving? Leaves like the things of man, you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder by and by, nor spare a sigh, though worlds of one would leaf meal lie. And yet you will weep, and know why. Now no matter, child, the name, sorrow's springs are the same, nor mouth had, no nor mind expressed, what heart heard of, ghost guessed. It is the blight man was born for, it is Margaret you mourn for. So think about the situation of the poem. It's Margaret, she's a child, a little baby girl, who's sitting there crying, right? And she's crying over the leaves that have fallen off of a tree, which reminds me of my corgi. It's a real quick tangent, but when I brush my corgi and I pull out the tufts of fur from the furminator, sometimes he gets upset because he thinks that part of him is dissipating or disappearing into the world or into the sky or the ether, and it kind of disturbs him. But it's not actually dissimilar to the way that Margaret might be feeling about the leaves falling from the trees. What is happening to this tree? Why are the beautiful leaves falling? Is it hurting? Is it in pain? What's happening to this? What's happening to nature now that we've seen it grow up as the youngest possible child, and then seeing our sort of first season of decay and of falling apart, right? So Margaret, are you grieving over golden grove unleaving? And this idea of unleaving, right? Falling off, leaves falling off of a tree, but also unleaving, the opposite of leaving, coming back, right? And so you get both spring and fall in that one sort of new word, unleaving. Leaves like the things of man, you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? And it's that sort of question. Once more, it brings us back to that divide between God and natural things, nature, and things that are created by man, right? And so the question is, do you care more for aging human beings or for the evidence of the decay in the world around you, right? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such that it's colder by and by. In other words, you're upset by fall now, you're upset by death and decay and the loss of things, but the more you live, the more you're going to understand that this is just part of life. It's cyclical, and that things return as much as they might appear to disappear too. And then we've got worlds of one would leaf meal lie. And I really like this idea of leaf meal, right? I've always read it as a kind of gloss on piecemeal, right? Something that is piecemeal is pieced together, is broken down, is components, not a whole. And so this idea of leaf meal, the tree falling apart bit by bit, chaotically. There's also this idea of leaf meal as something that's ground underfoot, the crunchy leaves that turn from leaf to dust to dirt, etc. One wood, white wood, pale wood, right? Decaying wood that's not dark brown, that's not suffused with life, etc. And yet you will weep and know why. So Margaret's sitting here crying, not realizing why she's crying. thinking she's crying about fall, about the leaves falling off of the tree. And the speaker of the poem says, okay, you don't really understand why it is you're crying right now, but you will. You'll get older, and you'll understand death and loss, and you'll cry for those reasons then. Now is not really the time to cry about death and decay, because this is just fall, right? But yet you will weep and know why. Again, a dark admonition to a child. Oh, you're going to cry, right? You are going to cry and suffer, and it's going to be terrible. But it isn't now, so shut up, right? Now no matter, child, the name. Sorrow's springs are the same. And then he corrects himself. He's like, okay, fine, so you're crying, but you're a baby, right? You're nothing more than a baby. You don't really understand why it is you're crying. And all tears come from the same place, and in that way we get sort of an understanding of sorrow as not a terrible thing, but a natural thing, and a thing that allows us to feel about the world. And to feel for the world, right? And the world here is not just human beings, but earth and nature too. I want us to be thinking about the ecological vision of Gerard, Manley, Hopkins, and that's question number 7, right? Finding in all the poems that we've talked about, as well as perhaps in Lindsay Poplar's or Duns Scotus's Oxford, which you can read on your own, I want you to isolate 4 natural images, specific, tight, natural images, and I want you just to break those down, explain them, provide a picture of them if you can find something that explicitly matches up to the description that's being given you, but find 4 of those natural images and sort of piece them out for me. Sorrow's springs are the same, nor mouth had no nor mind expressed, what heart heard of, ghost guessed. It is the blight man was born for, it is Margaret you mourn for. So this is where it gets kind of dark. At the beginning of the poem it's like, Margaret, why are you crying about leaves? You're crazy. You're a crazy girl. But by the end of the poem it's like, I totally understand why you're crying, Margaret, because you're crying about your own mortality. You just don't know it yet, right? So there's a couple of corrections here. You're crying about your own mortality, you're crying about this fall that is actually just sort of enacting the metaphorical fall from the Garden of Eden, and that there's nothing that can be done about the inherent nature of death in living things. Nothing will live forever, we will all die, right? And so when you cry about death, you're crying about the condition of death, which is necessarily part of life, fall, spring, winter, to summer. And so when you're crying about the condition of death, then you're also invoking your own death, right? And so you're crying over yourself too, right? And so we're sort of grieving about death, about the loss of things, the waning of things, the decay of things. All in this sort of cosmology and theology comes back to that original loss of the Garden of Eden, right? So think too about the Garden of Eden, all of its sort of fanciful implications, that it was the best garden on earth, it was the most sort of habitable place on earth, it was full of fruit and beauty, of sustenance and everything good, right? Capital G, good. And think about what it means then for us to take for granted that the nature we see around us is good and life-giving, only to have to confront the fact that it too will die like we do, and we will die like it does, and that is all sort of grounded in that failure of immortality in the Garden of Eden when we decided for knowledge as opposed to life everlasting, right? And so all of this is sort of a weirdly dark Catholic teaching poem to a child to tell her that she's sick, that she has original sin, that she is no less spared from the inevitability of death than any other thing that she might choose to cry about, right? It's a beautiful poem. It's a dark poem. It's a child's poem. It's a Christian poem. It's a nature poem. It's all of these things, but it's dark ultimately because it reminds us that there's no escaping this. And unless we have, as in Hopkins' view, right, the consolation of our religion and our belief in the afterlife, then this is just sort of how it all goes, right? And so if we don't have that belief, then we are only going to understand this as dark, not as light, if that makes sense, right? So he would ultimately kind of say that this is actually a cheerful poem, right? We all die. And then when we die, we get to go into better things, I guess, right? That said, right, we're moving into the dark sonnets. And so the following 3 sonnets that are there are described as the dark sonnets. Joan Didion, who's an American novelist and essayist, really famous one from the mid-20th century forward, wrote a really powerful book on grief called The Year of Magical Thinking, where she talks about the death of her husband and then the death of her daughter, and how it is that she created a life that she could live with in light of those losses, and how frequently she turned to literature to find cognates or explanations of that kind of a grief, or that descriptions of that kind of a loss, to find consolation that others have felt as deeply and as painfully as she did in those moments. And she points frequently to Gerard Manley Hopkins' dark sonnets as being expressions of wild grief and grieving, of fears of loss, of fears of sort of commitment even. And so each one of these sonnets sort of encapsulates reckoning with the world around us and trying to make sense of one's place inside that world. Carrion Comfort, right? It doesn't technically have a name. It's just sort of derived from the poem itself. Carrion is dead stuff, right? Dead animals, dead food, decaying things. Comfort is, of course, comfort. So when we're thinking about the very nature of the unit of the term carrion, comfort, think about what it means to be a vulture who might, thrive on eating dead and decaying things. You need this to live, and it's succor, and it's comfort, and it's nourishing to you, even as it appears to be dead and decaying and gross and unpalatable, right? But then also think about carrying comfort as the way in which we might sort of circle our own failures or look at loss or death or grief or failure sort of protectively, because it's something that we're familiar with. Carrying comfort to me is always also coded as something like self-pity, right? What does it mean to sort of grapple with who you are, with what you are, with the fact that you are imperfect, with the fact that you are not good, at least not holy, not capital G, and not without the tincture of bad. And what it means to look at the self and reckon with it, and in terms of carrying comfort, how sometimes misery is even comfortable, right? If it's familiar. So I want you guys to be listening for and carrying comfort. And again, you've had 6 questions so far. You'll have 1 or 2 more over the course of this lecture video thing. I want you to be looking for and listening for all of the negations, the no's, the undoings, prefixes in that regard, etc., right? So not, I'll not, carrying comfort, despair, not feast on thee, not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of man in me, or, most weary, cry I can no more. I can something, hope, wish day come, not choose not to be. But oh thou terrible, why wouldst thou rude on me, thy ring-whirled right foot rock, lay a lion limb against me? Scan with darksome devouring eyes my bruised bones, and fan, in turns of tempest, me heaped there, me frantic to avoid thee and flee. Why? That my chaff might fly, my grain lie sheer and clear? Nay, in all that toil, that coil, since, seems, I kissed the rod, hand rather, my heart low, lapped strength, stole joy, would laugh, cheer. Cheer whom, though? The hero whose heaven-handling flung me, foot-trod me, or me that fought him? Oh, which one? Is it each one? That night, that year of now-done darkness, I, wretch, lay wrestling with my God, my God. So, I'll not carrying comfort, despair, not feast on thee. Think about here getting into despair, self-pity, as the footnote points out. Think about despair as capital D, as one of those sort of 18th century sort of paragon virtues or failures. Despair, capital D. Not untwist slack they may be, these last strands of man in me. So think of strands of man. Think of that in terms of inscape, right? We talked about how inscape was the presence of God and God's design in all natural things. And think about the way that design here is being funneled into a weaving metaphor or a spinning yarn metaphor. That we're just sort of made of component parts by a master designer, a master aesthete or tradesman, who can put all these pieces together, these strands, and wind them together to make us whole. And thinking here of what self-pity means in terms of self-undoing, right? That the more we feel sorry for ourselves, the more bestial we become, the more beast-like, the more sad in terms of being pathetic. These last strains of man in me, or most weary cry, I can no more. I can no more. And of course it doesn't tell me I can do what, I can what. And in here it's very much like the meme sense of I just can't, right? Are you canning today? In terms of the snarky meme language, right? I can no more. But then there's that sort of quick turn inside the stanza itself. So this is a whole sonnet, but there are tons of these little turns inside of these thoughts themselves. I will not do this thing, cry, I can no more, period, I can, semicolon, can something, right? And that's one of those wonderful sort of modern uses of language, right? I can do something, I can something. Hope, wish day come, not choose, not to be. So in other words, like, I can't just sit here feeling sorry for myself and throwing out my hands and saying, like, I can't do anything about this, right? I can do something, right? Even if that something is really intangible or immaterial, like hope, right? Or wait for the next day, wish day come. Not choose not to be, in other words, to choose life, not choose to kill oneself or to end oneself, right? So that every time we sort of feel overwhelmed in this first stanza, as it's telling us, by these overwhelming sort of negative self-emotions, and then get full of self-pity, which feels comfortable because it's familiar, we need to remember that it's defeating, because it's just sort of boiling us in the stench of our own failure. And instead we need to think about doing something, right? Hoping, at least waiting for something to change, being patient, and letting something else intervene on your behalf. We can't just throw up our hands, right? And then the longer sort of arc of the poem, and in the bigger narrative of the poem, it's about faith, right? It's about accepting faith and accepting things on their front, not wrestling with them, not criticizing them, not tearing them down, but sort of letting things be. But oh thou terrible, why wouldst thou root on me thy ring-whirled right foot rock? And I want you, and this is question number 7, right, is to take that first, those first 2 lines of stanza 2, that's line 5 and 6, right, of carrying comfort. And I want you to unpack it. In other words, use entirely different language, and in a short paragraph explain to me what he means here. So follow the grammar, think it out, write it out. There are wrong answers, so I want you to use the clues that are in the poem, right? Lay a lion limb against me, scan with darksome devouring eyes my bruised bones, and fan, oh, in turns the tempest, me heaped there, me frantic to avoid thee and flee, right? So we're moving into the real thematic of the poem, which is struggling with faith, struggling with the nature of God, knowledge of God, belief in God. And so it's here that he starts to figure himself as this thing that is hunted, right? He's haunted and hunted by God, but it's terrifying, and it's not something that he's sure he can do. And so we get this image of him running away and hiding in a corner, right? Not wanting to be seen by this omnipotent, omniscient thing, who is going to yet once more sort of intervene in the shape of his life to deprive him of true agency over things, right? It's not that Catholics or Hopkins don't believe in free will. In fact, they do, right? And this whole poem shows us the wages of free will. What does it mean to choose not to believe in God? And what might that be? What does that pose? So it's not about free will, but it's about sort of the terror of the immensity of God when considered in all of its complexity, in the way that it makes you feel about yourself in light of that. How fearful and how awesome and terrifying, sublime in the terrifying sense, that God is, and the very idea of faith is to sort of a considerate, thinking human being, right? Why? That my chaff might fly, my grain lie sheer and clear. And take a moment just to look up an image of threshing, right? Threshing, which is the work of separating wheat from chaff and breaking off the usable materials from the plant in terms of making flour, right, to bake bread, etc. So my chaff might fly, all of the additional stuff, the dust, the straw, etc., that's all going to fly away on the threshing room floor, and what settles out is the grain, right? Sheer and clear. And so he's saying, that for all of this self-torture, all of this doubt, all of this struggle with this faith, that the whole purpose is that it's a trial, right? And that God knows what's best for us, and in knowing, challenges us to come to know what's best about us, right? That my chaff might fly, my grain lie sheer and clear. Nay, in all that toil, that coil, since seems I kissed the rod, hand rather. My heart low, lap strength, stole joy, would laugh cheer. And this idea of kissing the rod, the hand rather, is, I'm going to read this in this sort of very specifically Catholic sense, which is a way to say that he really came into an idea of his faith when he committed to being a priest, right? When he committed to joining the Jesuit order and taking orders, right? And so in that way, he moved from being a subject of God and the disciplinary action of God as meted out by God's servants, priests, nuns, monks, etc. He sort of leapfrogged ahead of that totally subject or abject space, and instead is sort of moving into something like a marriage with God. So he's kissing the hand as opposed to the rod that punishes. But also think about the hand versus the rod. The hand can soothe and nurture and nourish and comfort, but the rod is pretty universally bad, right? It's not going to do much good for you. Nay, in all that toil, that coil, since seems I kissed the rod, hand rather. My heart low, lapped strength, stole joy, would laugh cheer. One last little instance here of that list of things that he does, right, in his poetry, where he enumerates all of the possible options, etc. I want you to go back in, and this is question 8, and the final question for the Gerard, Manley, Hopkins thing, but I want you to go back and find all of the instances of labor and toil, and I want you to explain how each one of those instances works in its specific context. And so there aren't a ton, there are just a few, and I want you to say how the concept of toil or labor functions differently in each one of these things. I apologize if that seems like a lot, but we're not going to be in class, and so you don't actually have to participate until you do these small things. So, meh. So, all of that is to say that Carrying Comfort is about that sort of struggle with God, and it's at the end it turns into an actual wrestling match, right? That I'm just struggling with this idea of God and God's power and glory, and it's a struggling against self in light of what you would like God to be in and for you. It's enough about Carrying Comfort. I will just read out loud the next two, so you can start to hear what sort of keeps all three of these dark sonnets unified in theme, tone, and language. So no worst there is none. No worst there is none, pitched past pitch of grief, more pangs will, schooled at 4 pangs, wilder ring. Comforter, where is your comforting? Mary, mother of us, where is your relief? My cries heave, herds long, huddle in a main, a chief woe, world sorrow. On an age-old anvil wince and sing, then lull, then leave off. Fury had shrieked, no lingering, let me be fell, force, I must be brief. Oh, the mind has mountains, cliffs of fall, frightful sheer, no man fathomed. Hold them cheap may who never hung there. Nor does long or small durance deal with that steep or deep. Here, creep, wretch, under a comfort serves in a whirlwind. All life death does end, and each day dies in sleep. So thinking about the last two, Carrying Comfort, spring and fall, then those that last line especially, all life death does end and each day dies with sleep, is a way to sort of figure the life and death cycle into the structure of every biological day, right? That you're going to bed, you go to sleep, you lose consciousness, you come back up, wake up in the morning, and you're a living thing again. And although, of course, we know biologically that what happens to you while you sleep is a crucial biological functioning, but that nevertheless it becomes sort of a black sense in your own consciousness, right? Akin to a blackout or akin to a small death every day, right? But it's also like a wildly optimistic thing. All life death does end, so there's no one life that doesn't get at least either the relief of death or the inevitability of it. and each day dies with sleep, and so each day becomes sort of a unit in and of itself, closed off. You can go to sleep and you can become better. You can wake up healthier, happier, with something resolved perhaps. But that patience, resilience, etc., all of these things are crucial to living through the experience of grief or struggle. And then the last poem. I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. What hours, oh what black hours we have spent that night. What sights you, heart, saw, ways you went, and more must, and yet longer lights delay. What witness I speak this, but where I say hours, I mean years, mean life. And my lament is cries countless, cries like dead letters sent to dearest him that lives, alas, away. I am gall, I am heartburn. God's most deep decree bitter would have me taste, my taste was me. Bones built in me, flesh filled, blood brimmed the curse. Self-yeast of spirit a dull dough sours. I see the lost are like this, and their scourge to be, as I am mine, their sweating selves, but worse. And so he describes himself as all sort of bitter, acrid, poor-tasting things, bad-smelling things. Remember the smell of the toil of man in God's grandeur. Self-yeast of spirit, a dull dough sours. And it's this idea of the spirit or soul being a sourdough, being a starter, a yeast culture, right? But that if we become sort of soured, cynical, frightened, otherwise governed by our lack of faith or fear, etc., right? Then what we're meant to become, bread, beautiful bread, sourdough bread, we're meant to become is instead replaced by flat bread, undesirable bread, dull dough, right? I see the lost are like this, and their scourge to be as I am mine, their sweating selves, but worse. And think about the way that sweating self ramifies with all of the other invocations of the body in the rest of the Hopkins poetry here, right? Sweating self is the bad self, the earthly self, the material self, the one that can't attend to the vaunted and transcendent nature of spirit, right, or God, and God's goodness, greatness. So there's a bonus 9th question that if you turned it off after I told you there were no questions, you get an extra sort of quarter point for this, let's say. That final question that I want you guys to do is to, again, sort of correlate the other passages of sweating selves, right? So other places where that same concept arises in Hopkins poetry. But it's this idea in all 3 of the dark sonnets that life is not easy, right? And of course we can all verify that and vouch for it. Life is definitely not easy. It's a struggle, and the struggle is real. But that there's some responsibilities we have as living things. And as living things that may or may not feel ourselves indebted to God for life, we nevertheless do have responsibilities for making something of our lives, right? And so, to that end, allow me to explain how important it is that we go off and do good things in the world. I am going to just read out loud as a meditation, so bear with me, the final journal entry of Gerard Manley Hopkins in the Norton, 2238, August 10th, 1872. I was looking at high waves. The breakers always are parallel to the coast and shape themselves to it, except where the curve is sharp, however the wind blows. They are rolled out by the shallowing shore just as a piece of putty between the palms, whatever its shape, runs into a long roll. The slant ruck or crease one sees in them shows the way of the wind. The regularity of the barrel surprised and charmed the eye. The edge behind the comb or crest was as smooth and bright as glass. It may be noticed to be green behind and silver white in front. The silver marks where the air begins. The pure white is foam, the green solid water. Then looked at to the right or left, they are scrolled over like mold boards or feathers or jib sails seen by the edge. It is pretty to see the hollow of the barrel disappearing as the white combs on each side run along the wave, gaining ground till the two meet at a pitch and crush and overlap each other. About all the turns of the scraping from the break and flooding of wave to its run out again, I have not yet satisfied myself. The shores are swimming, and the eyes have before them a region of milky surf, but it is hard for them to unpack the huddling and gnarls of water and law out the shapes and the sequence of the running. I catch, however, the looped or forked wisp made by every big pebble the backwater runs over. If it were clear and smooth, there would be a network from their overlapping such as can in fact be seen on smooth sand after the tide is out. Then I saw it run browner, the foam dwindling, and twitched into long chains of suds, while the strength of the backdraft shrugged the stones together and clocked them against one another. So thinking just about the attention to which, and the patient attention to which Hopkins turns his eye and his mind. This is a description of one wave breaking. And of course, like, it's impossible to pin down one wave, right? And that's in the Sound of Music song about Maria. How do you solve a problem like Maria? How do you catch a wave upon the sand, right? One wave. How do you grapple with it? And so he's watching, of course, hundreds of waves. But nevertheless, he's trying to discern in this one thing, and it's not a thing. A wave is always in motion, right? So it's always a transition between something and something else. It's purely ephemeral. How this one thing sort of captures within it the design of everything, and that attention to this one thing can be a kind of an ethos of engagement with the world. That if you can attend to the really small things, then you might also be able to see the greater patterns, the greater design, right? And so I think all of Hopkins' poetry really requires us to slow down like he does. Maybe not see the same things, but to see things in nature, right? And to understand the complexity of minuscule objects as well as big ones, and the ways in which we can use all of his poems to understand scale, right? To go from the very large to the incredibly tiny, and to think of all of the work in between, right? So thank you for watching this. Thank you for answering the 8+1 bonus questions. And I will set up a form in UTC Learn for you to fill all those in, or to email me those things. Bye.